The air was thick with the scent of $90,000 being murdered. It wasn't a quick or merciful death, but a systematic execution, blow by heavy blow, vibrating through the skeletal structure of the only place I had ever truly called my own. I didn't see the destruction first. I smelled it. The chalky, suffocating ghost of pulverized drywall and the sharp, weeping scent of freshly splintered oak hanging in a stagnant cloud. A sudden void in my afternoon schedule, caused by a client's last-minute cancellation, was the only reason I found myself turning into my driveway 3 hours ahead of schedule. It is that one mundane, unremarkable shift in timing that continues to haunt my restless nights. If that meeting had proceeded as planned, I would have returned to a finished demolition. I would have walked into a house that had been hollowed out, greeted by a carefully curated story designed to make me feel grateful for my own victimization. Instead, I arrived just in time to hear the first strike. It was a sound that didn't belong in a residential neighborhood at 2 in the afternoon. It was the sound of metal meeting something dense and unforgiving, not the rhythmic, constructive tap of a carpenter, but a violent, chaotic thud. At first, my brain tried to protect me. I assumed a neighbor was having a tree removed or perhaps a delivery truck had backed into a bollard. But as I cut the engine, I saw it. A plume of fine, white dust pushing its way through the seams of my kitchen side window. My kitchen, the space I had spent 2 grueling years saving for. The room that represented my transition from a fixer-upper life to one of stability and aesthetic peace. I unlocked the front door with trembling fingers, and as the heavy wood swung open, I walked directly into a fog of powdered plaster. The grit settled on my tongue instantly, tasting like copper and old secrets. For several agonizing seconds, I stood frozen in the entryway, my mind refusing to render the data my eyes were sending it. The centerpiece of the home, the custom-carved island I'd agonized over for months, was fractured. A jagged lightning bolt of a crack ran right through the center of the stone. Cabinet doors, the ones I'd hand-selected for their specific grain, lay like discarded carcasses across the hardwood floor. And there, standing in the center of the wreckage like a conqueror, was my stepfather. He was hoisting a sledgehammer over his shoulder with the practiced ease of a man who enjoyed the weight of it. My sister stood by the sink leaning against a counter that hadn't been cleared of its morning coffee mugs, casually chatting with 2 men in heavy work boots. They were already busy unbolting the remains of the upper cabinetry, their power tools whining as they stripped the walls bare. The most chilling part wasn't the damage. It was the lack of surprise on their faces. They didn't jump. They didn't look guilty. "You're early," my sister said, her voice flat, devoid of any realization that she was currently trespassing in a crime scene. She didn't ask what I was doing in my own house. She didn't offer an explanation. To her, I was simply a scheduling inconvenience, a glitch in a plan that should have been executed while I was safely tucked away at my desk. "What is this?" I managed to choke out, my voice sounding small against the backdrop of falling debris. My stepfather lowered the heavy hammer, but he didn't set it down. He kept his grip firm on the handle, a subtle reminder of who held the physical power in the room. "We talked about updating this place," he said, his tone dripping with that familiar condescending paternalism. "It's outdated, kid. You're too stuck in your ways to see it. We're helping you move things along." Helping me. Is it possible for a word to be so distorted that it loses all meaning? These cabinets weren't outdated. I had commissioned them 8 months ago. They were custom-built, floor-to-ceiling masterpieces of woodwork. Between the rare stone, the lighting fixtures, and the labor, I had poured nearly $100,000 into this single room. It was the first part of the house that felt entirely mine, free from the suggestions and improvements my family had forced on me since I bought the place. "I didn't agree to this," I said, stepping further into the room. "I never signed off on a demolition. Stop, right now." My sister crossed her arms, her eyes rolling with a practiced annoyance that made me feel like I was 10 years old again, complaining about a broken toy. "You never decide anything," she countered. "You'd sit in this house until it rotted around you because you're too afraid to make a move. We're just taking the initiative for you." There it was, the narrative they'd spent my entire life building. I was the hesitant one, the indecisive one, the weak one who needed a firm hand to guide his life. It didn't matter that I had saved the money, hired the contractors, and designed the layout myself. In their eyes, I was still the child who couldn't be trusted with his own sovereignty. I stepped toward the island, my hand reaching out to touch the ruined marble. "Stop," I repeated, this time louder. One of the hired workers hesitated, his drill hovering over a hinge. He looked at my stepfather, then back at me, sensing the tectonic shift in the room's energy. But my stepfather didn't hesitate. He was a man who had spent 30 years being right, even when he was catastrophically wrong. He ignored me, lifted the sledgehammer one more time, and brought it down into the fractured heart of the island. The sound of the stone shattering was final. It was the sound of a boundary being turned into dust. I reached for the handle of the hammer, a desperate, instinctive attempt to save what was left. I didn't even get close. With a grunt of effort, he shoved me back. It wasn't a gentle push to keep me away. It was a violent, dismissive shove that sent me stumbling into the jagged edge of a broken cabinet. Everything after that happened in a blur of adrenaline and sensory overload. I don't remember the specific words I screamed. I only remember the impact. It wasn't a wild, swinging punch born of sudden rage. It was a short, practiced professional motion. His fist landed square against my cheekbone, the force of it rattling my skull and sending a metallic tang of blood into the back of my throat. The room went deathly silent. The whine of the power tools cut out. The workers suddenly found the floor very interesting. I tasted blood in my own living room, standing on a floor I paid for, surrounded by debris I had worked 2 years to afford. "Don't start acting dramatic," he said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead as if he were the one who had been wronged. "This is what's best for the property value. You'll thank us when it's done." I looked at my sister. I waited for her to scream. I waited for her to rush to me, or to yell at him, or to show even a flicker of horror that our stepfather had just assaulted me in my own home. But she wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared at a pile of broken wood, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line of complicity. In that moment, something shifted. It wasn't an explosion of anger. It was something much colder. A strange clinical detachment washed over me, like I was watching a recorded rehearsal of a play that had been running for 20 years. I thought about the tools he'd borrowed and never returned. I thought about the times I'd come home to find my furniture rearranged because my sister thought it flowed better. I thought about the subtle, constant jokes at Thanksgiving about how I overthink everything. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was just the first time they'd used a sledgehammer instead of a suggestion. Have you ever realized, in a single heartbeat, that the people who share your blood are the ones most likely to drain it? I didn't say another word. I didn't hit him back. I simply turned and walked out the front door. I sat in my car with the engine off, watching the white dust drift through the open doorway like smoke from a battlefield. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. Twice. It was my sister. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my email and pulled up a folder I'd kept labeled property. I looked at the deed. I looked at the refinance paperwork from the previous year. My name, and only my name, was on every single page. I was the sole owner. I owed them nothing. Then, I opened my camera app. The previous winter, after some expensive power tools had mysteriously vanished from my garage, I had installed high-definition interior cameras. My family had mocked me for it. They called me paranoid. They said it made the house feel like a prison. Now, I watched the live feed on my screen. I saw my stepfather arguing with the lead worker. The men were uneasy now. They were looking around, realizing that helping a family member might actually be participating in a felony. I called my attorney first. He had been through my divorce and my business filings. He knew the history of my family's overreach. Then I called the police. I didn't shout. I didn't exaggerate. I spoke with a terrifying, calm clarity. I reported a physical assault. I reported active property destruction in progress without the owner's consent. I told the dispatcher I had live video evidence of the crime occurring at that very moment, and I gave them remote access to the feed. When I finally stepped back inside, the atmosphere had curdled. The workers were standing by the door, their tool belts already half unbuckled. "Do you have the permit for this?" the lead worker was asking my stepfather. "We don't need a permit for a family project," my stepfather snapped back, his face reddening. "We do if it's structural," the man replied, his voice dropping an octave. "And this looks a lot like we're messing with a load-bearing partition." The argument didn't have time to escalate further. The sirens arrived with a sudden jarring authority that sliced through the domestic tension. There is a specific kind of gravity that uniforms carry, a weight that family arguments can never replicate. When the two officers stepped over the threshold, taking in the scene of the broken stone, the white fog, and the sledgehammer leaning against the ruined counter, the power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it shattered. "Who owns this property?" one officer asked, his hand resting casually but firmly near his belt. "I do," my stepfather said immediately, his voice booming with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been told no by someone in a badge. I didn't argue. I didn't even look at him. I simply stepped forward and handed the officer my phone. He scrolled through the digital deed, cross-referenced it with my ID, and then looked at the interior camera footage I had already queued up. He watched the shove. He watched the punch. He watched the sledgehammer come down on the marble after I had clearly asked them to stop. The officer looked up from the screen, his expression unreadable. He turned to my stepfather and asked the one question that settles everything in a court of law. "Did you strike him?" Silence followed. It was a thick, heavy silence that tasted of impending consequences. My stepfather's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at the camera lens tucked into the corner of the ceiling, the one he'd called a symptom of my paranoia, and realized it had been his silent witness. The workers were the first to move. They didn't say goodbye. They just picked up their bags and walked out, their boots heavy on the hardwood. They weren't getting paid enough to be accomplices to a family's psychological collapse. My sister's voice finally returned, but it had lost its razor edge. It was high, thin, and desperate. "This is just a misunderstanding," she kept repeating, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. "We were just trying to help. He's so indecisive, we thought we'd surprise him. It's a family matter." But she wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was looking at the handcuffs hanging from the officer's belt. Loneliness makes dangerous choices feel reasonable. I watched them lead him out. I watched my sister follow them into the driveway, sobbing about how I was destroying the family over some pieces of wood and stone. I stood in the middle of my ruined kitchen, the white dust settling on my shoulders like snow, and for the first time in my life, I felt the true weight of my own home. The charges were filed that afternoon: assault and criminal mischief. It wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a case number. The construction company contacted me the following morning, their legal department practically tripping over themselves to apologize and distance themselves from the situation. They offered to testify that they were misled about the ownership of the house. The kitchen stayed in a state of violent disrepair for months. Every time I walked in to get a glass of water, I had to navigate around the jagged remains of the island. Every time I looked at the walls, I saw the scars where the cabinets had been ripped away. The flying monkeys started calling within 48 hours. Uncles I hadn't spoken to in years, cousins, my mother's old friends. They all had the same script. "It's family," they whispered into my voicemail. "Don't make it worse than it already is. Think of the holidays. Drop the charges. He's an old man. He didn't mean it." But I wasn't the one who had made it worse. I was simply the one who refused to erase what had happened. I was the one who refused to let the peace be bought with my own silence. Have you ever noticed how keeping the peace usually just means one person is expected to sit quietly while everyone else screams? The court process was agonizingly slow and remarkably uneventful. There were no dramatic outbursts or cinematic confessions. It was a series of cold rooms, fluorescent lights, and paperwork. My stepfather, realizing that the video evidence was undeniable, took a plea deal to avoid a public trial. Restitution was ordered, a sum that made even his eyes water. A permanent no-contact condition was attached to the sentencing. My sister moved 3 states away a few weeks after the sentencing. She sent one final email, a long, rambling manifesto about how cold I had become. I didn't reply. I blocked the address. Rebuilding the kitchen took another 6 months. I didn't replicate the old design. I couldn't. It felt dishonest to pretend that the old me still lived here. I chose different materials, darker, stronger, more resilient. I oversaw every nail, every slab of stone, every wire. Sometimes, I stand at the new counter in the middle of the night, the house quiet and still around me, and I think about that punch. I think about the copper taste of the blood and the sound of the sledgehammer. I realize that the kitchen wasn't what they were trying to destroy. They were trying to destroy the idea that I could exist without their permission. Desire whispers louder than guilt. They desired control more than they felt guilt for the betrayal, and I desired freedom more than I feared the conflict. There was no grand celebration when the final restitution payment cleared into my bank account. There was no "I told you so" moment. Just a quiet notification on my phone while I was making coffee. The house feels different now. It's emptier, certainly. The silence where my sister's voice used to be is profound, but the air is also clearer. The dust has finally, completely settled. No one lifts a hammer in this house anymore without my express written permission. And no one, absolutely no one, mistakes my silence for weakness ever again. If you've ever had to choose between your family and your sanity, I want to hear your story in the comments. How did you know when it was finally time to stop keeping the peace? If this story resonated with you, or if you want to see more narratives about reclaiming power from the people who were meant to protect you, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps me continue to share these truths, and it lets others know they aren't alone in the wreckage.